Alcohol was involved, story number 13. I've got a gun. After deciding that 2 years of college was plenty for me and not quite having control over my rudder yet, I moved back home to get my bearings. My dad said that was fine, but every Friday he expected a $40 rent on his home office desk. Having worked most of the second year in college still didn't present me with whatever a savings account is. I was in a bit of a panic, and my Triumph Spitfire didn't run on air. Beer doesn't grow on trees. I worked the help wanted ads and got an interview at a very high-paying job at a titanium materials warehouse. They liked me. A lie detector test was next. What? Why? I went as scheduled and apparently failed the drug-related questions. I was told it was a high-security facility with government contracts and you had to have a clean past life. On to the next ad at another warehouse where I was hired immediately. As a tween, I accompanied my dad on a trip to Pennsylvania where he supervised setting up a warehouse for his company's products. I helped. It was quite the education that I absorbed like a sponge, and someday I ended up owning my own warehouses. So I understood enough to jump right in the new job and get at it. By the way, they don't know what a pop machine is in Pennsylvania. I also discovered Cheech and Chong on that trip through the lifeguards at the hotel pool. If my dad only knew. Having some restaurant experience in college, I turned my attention to waiter opportunities and landed a wait job at a very busy restaurant. Good tips. Perfect while I figured out what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. I met a girl there and we dated and then moved in together. We got an apartment in a cheap, not-so-nice neighborhood, but wasn't home much, so it didn't bother us. She was 11 years older than me, and that made things interesting. We were parked behind a bistro late one night after the band finished when a knock came to the window and a bright light shined in our faces. A police officer wanted to see our IDs. We each gave him our driver's license, and he looked at hers for a long time. Then he looked at mine again, handed it back to me, and said, "Good for you." Funny guy. I wondered if he was the same officer that pulled me over at 1 a.m. after I just finished a late night of drinking and playing liar's poker with none other than the head coach of our local NFL team and the bartender, just to ask me how much I wanted for the car I was driving. I had a for sale sign in the window. This was pre-cell phone days. In the moment of being under the influence of truth serum, I made a full confession as to where I had come from and what I was doing without him even asking me. That prompted him to ask, "How much farther do you have to go?" I lied and answered, "Just up to the next light and I'm home." "Okay, take it easy. I'll call you about the car. Looks perfect for my wife." He did, it was, and I made a few bucks off a car I had just bought because it looked like a good deal. I was unaware that this was the first signs of entrepreneurship and would later become my career focus. Serial entrepreneurship, that is, not selling cars. Our crappy little apartment was above an interesting guy, his wife and little baby who were locals. We weren't local and comparatively drove cars that didn't belong on the street. But alcohol is a great icebreaker and sometimes an olive branch when you're in a strange place and need one. I needed that olive branch one night after my girlfriend threw something at me and hit the fish aquarium instead and spilling out 10 gallons of water onto his ceiling. She was drunk. I was trying to sleep. My downstairs neighbor and new friend painted cars for a living. I gathered early on in our friendship that he was one of those big, strong kids in high school you don't mess with or you might get hurt. But he was a nice, soft-spoken guy and worked hard to take care of his young family. I respected him for that. Others we ran into that knew him respected him as well, but I suspect for other reasons. Sometimes on my day off, I'd take him a 12-pack and we'd sit around talking and getting to know each other better. Sometimes he'd be watching the baby in the evenings while his wife worked at the local supermarket. Sometimes we'd watch TV. Something we were watching spurred a conversation about guns, and he quickly produced a .44 Magnum. This gun is really a handheld cannon. No surprise to me that he owned one. He was flashing it around pretty good, and I didn't know him well enough to assume anything that might resemble gun safety. I, on the other hand, grew up with guns and hunting and knew that his handling of this weapon was not safe. I wondered if it was loaded and was about to ask when he suddenly pointed it at the TV and pulled the trigger. Bam! It went off and blew the TV tube to smithereens. It literally exploded. By the look on his face, this came as a complete shock to him as well. I may have wet myself, but for some reason I wasn't really surprised. This is how people get killed, right in their own living room watching TV. Time to change the scenery. After the shock of the exploding TV incident, we made the brilliant decision after his wife got home and after drinking a six-pack each to go out to a bar and have some more drinks. He left the TV mess and we got into his van. Not being as familiar with the area as him, he decided we should go to a local ski area that has a club open during the summer off-season. Before we got out of the van at the resort parking lot, he reached up above his visor and pulled out a bag of weed. My second surprise of the evening. He said he had a bunch of this and wanted to get rid of a few bags if someone was interested. I, of course, full of firewater, instantly grabbed the bag from him and said, "No problem." The resort was pretty happening and packed with people. We ordered a couple of beers and he said he was going to see if he could sell a bag. I decided to do the same and wandered around looking for the right person to approach. Today we call this profiling. Since it was the 70s and I had been to a very liberal university when it comes to all things marijuana, I figured I was looking for a guy with long hair that looked like he smoked weed. I wandered into the arcade room and approached a young guy with very long hair playing a pinball machine. I asked him if he wanted to buy some pot. He said, "Yeah, sure, come on, follow me." Of course I followed him and he led me down some stairs into some hallways that turned into what appeared to be administrative offices for the ski resort. We walked into an office and he said, "Just have a seat over there, I'll be right with you." Like an idiot, I sat down, looked around, and realized I had asked the wrong guy to buy pot. I immediately took the bag out of my pocket and threw it behind a table fan that was on the floor against the wall. One of those big box fans that you can set on a table or on the floor. A big bouncer-looking guy marched in and sat behind the desk. The long hair, who was clearly an employee at the ski resort, began telling the big guy about my attempt to sell him drugs. And so the interrogation began. "What's your name? Where are you from? What the fuck do you think you're doing here? Empty your pockets." I complied and emptied my pockets onto the desk. No pot. "Search him," ordered the big guy. A third employee had entered the room, and I figured out that these three guys were actually security for the resort, albeit somewhat undercover. The two younger guys searched me. One held me while the other felt me up. No pot, no pleasure. "Where's the weed?" "What weed?" I bravely and arrogantly snapped back. A big discussion ensued between the long-haired security guard I tried to sell it to and the big boss guy. I said he was lying. He was getting angry. I said a lot of things, including, "I'm calling the police if you don't let me go." The big guy finally told me to never come back, bad things would happen to me, blah, blah, blah. Then he told the two plainclothes security guards to walk me to the car. I didn't like the sound of that. The three of us walked down the hallway, up the stairs, and out the door to the large parking lot. My neighbor and I arrived late, and now the resort was closed. I must have been in the office area a lot longer than I realized. I could see my neighbor standing next to his van at the far end of the parking lot. The two younger security guards were walking very close to me, one on each side. The big guy trailed behind. I sensed what was going to happen next and started swinging my arms forward and backward, getting ready for the attack, and it came quick. They jumped on me and started swinging. I hit the ground and decided the best course of action was to cover up and protect my head and neck just like you would do in a bear attack. I'd spent the summer between high school and college backpacking in grizzly bear country in the Rockies and knew all about what to do, but never dreamed I'd be doing it in the parking lot of a ski resort. The pounding didn't last long and the alcohol numbed the blows. They backed off and I got up. My neighbor was now on his way over and I felt the courage to confront the big guy face to face, albeit he was about twice my size. I was angry. As I stepped forward, he pulled his coat back to show me he was carrying a firearm. He looked at my neighbor, and they knew each other. The big guy said, "I have a gun." Looking at my neighbor, he said respectfully, "I don't want any trouble with you." I was right. My neighbor was a local badass. While they chatted, I announced I was calling the police. I now noticed I had blood on my face and not sure how hurt I was and didn't care. The big guy said, "Go ahead." I used the payphone inside the front door and dialed 911. Let's recap. A guy is calling the police because he got beat up trying to sell drugs to a security guard at a ski resort. I know, right? The sheriff came and seemed to know everyone but me. He pulled me aside and quietly asked me if I knew who I was dealing with. I was very confused. I'm trying to be the victim here. Can't he see I'm bleeding? He explained that the resort was owned by the mob, and if he was me, he would just let this go and not come back. We took his advice and headed to the van. I inspected my face in the side mirror, and it appeared my nose was pushed into the parking lot asphalt, causing a nice gash on the bridge. Blows to the back of the head will do that. I held a rag on it while my neighbor drove us to a bar that was still open on the way back to our crappy apartments. I was now officially living another life in another world. We sat at the bar and was served by a reluctant bartender eyeballing my face. But she knew my neighbor as well, and he told her everything was all right. Just a little accident. Alcohol was involved.